By the time she stops crying, we'll be on a beach in Portugal. That was my husband Gerald's voice, coming through the garage wall 12 days before I buried him. The woman laughing on the other end of that phone was Diane Foster, my best friend of 31 years, the woman who sat at my Sunday table more times than I can count. So at his funeral, I leaned over the polished oak casket, laid down one white rose, and whispered, "I know you can hear me." The lid moved. But that is not the twist. The twist is who was inside. My name is Margaret Hale. I am 67 years old, and I live in the same brick house on Concord Street in Millbrook, Ohio, that I have lived in for 34 years. For 29 of those years, I was the librarian at Whitfield Elementary School. I shelved books, I taught children how to find things that were hidden, and I learned something that most people never learn. Quiet people notice everything. Nobody watches the quiet woman in the corner. That was their first mistake. I married Gerald Hale in June of 1984 in the Methodist Church on 4th Street, in a dress my mother sewed by hand because we could not afford the one in the shop window. 41 years. I want you to sit with that number the way I have had to sit with it. 41 years of packed lunches, of hospital waiting rooms, of holding his hand through 2 business failures and 1 triple bypass scare that turned out to be indigestion and cost us $4,300 in tests we paid off over 11 months. When his hardware store went under in 1998, I took $63,000 out of my teacher's retirement account to settle his debts so he would not have to declare bankruptcy. I did it without being asked. In 2011, when he decided he was going to run fishing charters on Barton Lake, I signed over another $27,000 for a boat that spent more time in our driveway than on the water. When my mother, Eleanor, passed in 2004, she left me $180,000, every dollar of it earned cleaning other people's houses, and I used it to pay off our home. Her lawyer, a careful old man named Mr. Brandt, insisted the deed stay in my name alone. "Your mother's wish," he said, and would not budge. Gerald sulked about it for a month. I remember thinking he was being childish. I did not know I was being protected from 20 years away. And then there was Diane. I met Diane Foster in the church choir in 1985, 2 altos sharing 1 hymnal, and for 3 decades she was the sister I never had. When her husband left her in 2009, I paid her rent. $700 a month for 14 months, $9,800 in total, and I never once mentioned it again. I co-signed the loan on her Honda in 2016. I sat with her through her mother's funeral, her gallbladder surgery, her bad boyfriends, and every Thanksgiving she did not want to spend alone. She had a key to my house. She knew where I kept my mother's ring. I am telling you these numbers not because money is what matters. I am telling you because when the people you built your life around decide you are disposable, the numbers are the receipts. And I have kept every one. It started small, the way these things always do. Last January, Gerald, a 69-year-old man with atrial fibrillation, diagnosed in 2021, a man who groaned getting out of his recliner, suddenly joined Riverside Fitness. $89 a month. He started walking 4 miles a day. He bought new clothes, 2 sizes down, and a bottle of cologne I had never smelled before. A wife of 41 years could tell herself a story about that. A new lease on life. A health scare taken seriously, finally. I told myself that story for exactly 6 weeks. Then came the phone. Gerald had used the same passcode since 2015. Our anniversary, 0684. In February, it stopped working when I tried to check the weather while he was in the shower. He said the phone had updated itself. Phones do not invent new passcodes, but I nodded and handed it back. I nodded a great deal in those months. Nodding is very useful. People mistake it for blindness. In March, I found the first withdrawal. We have shared a checking account at Millbrook Savings since Reagan was president, and I have balanced it to the penny every month of my life. $900, cash, on March 4th. $900 more on March 18th. By June, there had been 10 of them. $9,000, always in amounts just small enough not to trigger the bank's reporting paperwork. When I asked, gently, over meatloaf, Gerald said he was helping Ronnie at the lodge with a roof situation. I called Ronnie's wife, Barb, the next day about a casserole recipe and worked the roof into the conversation. There was no roof. There was no situation. There was only my husband, lying to me over the dinner I had cooked him, with gravy on his chin. And Diane. Diane changed too, in ways only a best friend would catch. She started wearing a perfume that cost more than her grocery budget. She got vague. Diane Foster had never been vague a day in her life. She was the kind of woman who could tell you what everyone at church paid for their car, and suddenly she couldn't remember where she'd been on a Saturday. She canceled our Tuesday coffees twice in 1 month, something that had happened maybe 4 times in 30 years. And once, in April, she looked at my kitchen, my curtains, my mother's dishes in the hutch, my life, with an expression I had never seen on her face before. It took me weeks to name it. It was not envy. Envy I could have forgiven. It was appraisal. She was looking at my kitchen the way you look at something you have already decided to leave behind. Still, I did not let myself assemble it. You must understand, when you have loved people for decades, your mind protects them for you. It files each strange thing in a separate drawer so you never have to see them side by side. The gym in one drawer, the passcode in another, the withdrawals, the perfume, the appraising eyes, all filed separately, all explained separately, all survivable separately. The envelope emptied the drawers onto the table. It came on May 29th, a Thursday, addressed to Gerald from Meridian Life Insurance Company. Gerald was at the gym. I had been opening our household mail for 41 years, so I opened it, the way I had opened 1,000 others. It was a single page. This letter confirms the recent change of beneficiary on Policy No. 4471,802H. The policy was Gerald's term life policy. The face value was $750,000. We had bought it together in 2003, sitting side by side at an agent's desk, and the beneficiary had been me. Margaret Eleanor Hale, wife, for 22 years. The new beneficiary was something called the D&G Family Trust. D&G. I stood in my kitchen holding that piece of paper, and I will be honest with you, because you and I are past politeness now. My legs went. I sat down on the floor of my own kitchen, 67 years old, in my apron, and I stared at the refrigerator Diane had helped me pick out, and I understood that D did not stand for anything in my name. I did not cry that day. That surprised me, and maybe it will surprise you. What I felt was colder than tears and much more useful. I felt my mind clear, the way the sky clears after a storm front pushes through. Everything suddenly sharp-edged and far too visible. Every drawer opened at once. The gym, a 69-year-old man getting fit enough to start a new life. The withdrawals, $9,000 in walking around money that could not be traced. The passcode, the perfume, the appraisal in my best friend's eyes. And one more thing, a thing I had filed so deep I had almost lost it. In February, Gerald had asked me, casually, over coffee, the way you'd ask about the weather, whether I would want him buried or cremated when the time came. I had laughed and told him to stop being morbid. He had pressed, just a little. But if it were sudden, Margie? Closed casket, quick service, none of that fuss. That's what I'd want. Promise me. I had promised. A wife promises. I sat on my kitchen floor and I heard those words again, and I understood I had not been comforting my husband. I had been rehearsed. Here is where I made the decision that changed everything, and I want to explain it carefully, because it was not rage and it was not revenge. It was arithmetic. If I confronted Gerald that evening, waving the letter, what would happen? He would lie. They would slow down, get smarter, get a post office box. And a woman my age, shouting about insurance beneficiaries with no proof of anything illegal. I know how that story goes. She's confused. She's paranoid. Poor Margaret. I had watched it happen to Dorothy Kessler from the choir when she accused her son of draining her accounts, and Dorothy had been right, and it had not mattered because she had been loud before she was ready. My mother used to say, "Watch what people do with your quiet, Margaret. It will tell you everything." So I made my decision on the kitchen floor, before I even stood up. I would say nothing. I would put the letter back in its envelope, steam it closed, and set it in the mail pile. I would become exactly the woman they needed me to be. Trusting, tired, a little slow. And I would watch them build the thing they were building, plank by plank, and I would write down every nail. I stood up. I steamed the envelope, shut over the kettle. I put a roast in the oven. And when Gerald came home smelling of that new cologne, I kissed his cheek and asked about his workout, And he told me, and I smiled. You may wonder how a person does that. How she serves pot roast to a man she now suspects is planning to die on paper and abandon her, in fact. I will tell you how. You think about 41 years. You think about $63,000 and $27,000 and $9,800 and a hand-sewn wedding dress. You let the weight of all of it settle onto your shoulders. And then you decide that the last chapter of that story will be written by you in your handwriting and no one else's. After that, the smiling is easy. The smiling is armor. The first person I told was Rosalind Pierce. Rosalind is an attorney 2 towns over in Harlan Falls, 62 years old, sharp as a paper cut, and this mattered. A complete stranger to everyone Gerald and Diane knew. I found her the old-fashioned way, through the County Bar Association, and I paid her retainer in cash I had been quietly setting aside from my own pension deposits. Her office smelled like coffee and old paper, and when I finished laying it all out, the letter, the withdrawals, the gym, the rehearsed promise about the closed casket, she took off her reading glasses, looked at me for a long moment, and said, "Mrs. Hale, do you know what I like about you?" I said I did not. "You brought documents?" She tapped the folder I had assembled. Bank statements with the withdrawals flagged in yellow. A photocopy of the Meridian letter. Dates. Times. The receipt from Riverside Fitness. Most people bring me feelings. You brought me a case file. Now let me tell you what I think you already suspect. She leaned back. A beneficiary change to a trust, cash structured under reporting limits, a spouse suddenly getting his affairs in order and coaching you on a quick closed casket funeral. Margaret, nobody does all of that to run off with a girlfriend. You don't need a death certificate to leave your wife. You need a death certificate to collect on policy number 4470-1802H. Hearing it said out loud, in a lawyer's office, in daylight, was like touching a stove I already knew was hot. It burned anyway. Rosalind did 3 things in the next 2 weeks, and each one mattered. First, she quietly confirmed that the D&G Family Trust had been registered in March, and that its trustee of record was one Diane Marie Foster. I want to tell you, I was shocked. I was not. There is a particular grief in being right about something like that, and I felt it fully, sitting in my parked car outside the library, holding the paper with my best friend's name on it. 31 years. 2 altos, 1 hymnal. I allowed myself 20 minutes of it by the clock. Then I drove home and defrosted chicken because the woman they thought I was had dinner to make. Second, Rosalind explained the law to me in plain words. Faking a death to collect life insurance is fraud, and fraud that size is a felony. But, and this was the part that kept me up at night, if I knew about it and stayed silent while a claim was filed, I could be painted as part of it. My silence had a deadline. We were not just gathering proof. We were racing to have enough of it before Gerald died. Third, she made a phone call that changed the shape of everything. Insurance companies, it turns out, have their own detectives, a special investigations unit. Rosalind knew a man at Meridian named Marcus Webb, a former fraud examiner with a voice like gravel and a memory like flypaper. We met him at a diner off Route 9 where nobody knew my face. Marcus ordered pie he never touched, listened to me for 40 minutes without interrupting, and then said the sentence I will remember for the rest of my life. Mrs. Hale, in 26 years, I have seen exactly 4 of these attempted. You are the first spouse who ever caught it before the funeral. He slid his card across the table. Here's what we're going to do. Nothing. Publicly, nothing. You are going to be the most convincing grieving wife this county has ever seen, and you are going to let them hand us the evidence themselves. People mid-scheme get careless. Your job is to be the reason they feel safe being careless. So that became the plan, and I want to walk you through it exactly, because the strategy is the part that matters. This was not luck. This was 3 months of method. Stage 1 was the performance. I became softer, slower. I mentioned to Gerald, wistfully, that I'd been forgetting things, where I'd put my keys, what day the trash went out. I let Diane catch me crying once, over nothing, just missing mother. I watched relief move across both their faces when they thought I wasn't looking, and I understood something that still chills me. My weakness was a load-bearing wall in their plan. They needed me diminished. Every time I seemed smaller, they got bolder. So I got smaller, and they got bolder. And I wrote everything down in a spiral notebook I kept taped inside a box of Christmas decorations in the attic, because there are two places no one in my family has ever voluntarily gone: the attic and my mother's recipes. Stage 2 was the money. On Rosalind's instruction, I did not move a dollar in any way Gerald could see. But my pension deposits quietly began landing in a new account at a credit union in Harlan Falls. The house, thanks to my mother and stubborn old Mr. Brandt, was already mine alone. Rosalind drafted, and I signed a petition for legal separation, fully prepared, dated, and undated in one crucial blank, sitting in her office safe like a fire extinguisher behind glass. And I made a full inventory, with photographs, of everything in that house my own money had bought, which, when I finished the list at 2 a.m. one Tuesday, turned out to be very nearly all of it. Stage 3 was the watching. Marcus taught me the rule: never follow, never confront, never touch their things. Just notice and note. What time Gerald left. What the mileage on the Buick said. Which night's Diane's Honda. The Honda I co-signed was parked 2 streets over from the Lake Road turnoff instead of at her apartment. It was Marcus who confirmed what the mileage already suggested. The two of them were spending long afternoons at Diane's late uncle's cabin on Barton Lake, a place I had picnicked at least a dozen times, back when I believed I knew what my life was. Now we come to the garage, and the phone call you heard at the very beginning. It was a Thursday evening in late August. Gerald thought I had gone to choir practice. I had made a point of announcing it, purse on my shoulder, at 6:40. Instead, I had driven around the block, parked at the Hendersons, and walked back through my own side yard to fetch the casserole dish I had forgotten, which I had, of course, forgotten on purpose. Marcus had taught me that too. Always have a real reason to be where you are. The garage window was open 3 inches for the heat. Gerald was pacing. I could hear the workbench stool scrape, and his voice had a looseness in it I hadn't heard in years. He sounded young. That was its own kind of knife. 12 days, D. 12 days, and Gerald Hale is a memory. A pause, her voice a warm murmur I couldn't make out. Then him, laughing. By the time she stops crying, we'll be on a beach in Portugal. Tommy's got everything staged at the home. Paperwork's clean, caskets weighted, old Holleran signs off Saturday morning and files it Monday. Closed casket, quick service, exactly like I told her I wanted. She promised me herself. Another pause. And then the sentence that took the last soft thing in me and turned it to stone. Margie? Come on. Margie will do what Margie does. She'll cry. She'll cook for everybody at the reception. And she'll sign whatever the trust paperwork tells her to sign. She's been half checked out for months anyway. Forgets what day the trash goes. Honestly, D, in a year she'll barely remember what I looked like. I stood in my side yard, in the smell of my own cut grass, holding an empty casserole dish, listening to my husband of 41 years describe my grief as a scheduling item. Cry. Cook. Sign. That was my resume after 4 decades. And the cruelest part, the part I want you to hear, is that the confusion he was so smugly cataloging was a costume I had sewn for him myself. He was mocking the disguise. He had no idea there was a woman inside it taking dictation. I walked back to the Hendersons, sat in my car, and wrote it all down with a shaking hand. Tommy. Holleran. Saturday. Weighted casket. Then I called Marcus, and Marcus called Detective Anita Cruz of the County Financial Crimes Unit, because a plan with a funeral director and a doctor in it had just stopped being an insurance matter and become a criminal conspiracy with names attached. The names were easy to fill in. Tommy was Thomas Foster, Diane's cousin, 3rd-generation owner of Foster and Sons Funeral Home on Delano Avenue, a man who had buried my own mother and shaken my hand at the graveside. Dr. Everett Holleran was a semi-retired physician who ran a cash-friendly walk-in clinic out past the fairgrounds and, Detective Cruz later confirmed, owed $61,000 in back taxes, which is exactly the kind of number that makes a man's signature flexible. $15,000, we learned afterward, was his price for writing cardiac arrest on a certificate for a heart that was still beating. Detective Cruz was younger than my daughter and twice as blunt, and I thank God for her. She sat at my kitchen table, the same table, and yes, I noticed the poetry of that and laid out the hard truth. Mrs. Hale, an overheard call is a start, not a case. If we move now, it's your word against theirs, and everyone lawyers up, and maybe we get a paperwork charge on the doctor. If we wait until they file the death certificate and Diane submits the claim, we have them for insurance fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. All of them, cold. She looked at me steadily. But waiting means you attend a funeral you know is fake, and you say nothing, and you let your whole town grieve a living man. I won't pretend that's a small thing to ask. I told her what I will tell you. After what I heard through that garage window, standing at a fake grave was going to be the easiest acting of my life. So we prepared. Rosalind filed my separation petition under seal, dated the day before Gerald's scheduled death, so no court could ever say I stood to gain a widow's penny. Marcus flagged policy 4470-1802H inside Meridian, so the claim would be routed straight to his desk and paid to no one. Detective Cruz got her warrants lined up like dominoes: the funeral home's records, Holleran's clinic, the trust's bank account, and this detail matters. Remember it. A small GPS tracker, court authorized, on the Buick. And I made one arrangement of my own, and I told no one. Not even Rosalind, because it was not legal strategy. It was personal. Tucked into the lining of Gerald's good gray overcoat, the coat I had bought him at Kaufman's in 1996, the coat he would take with him into any new life, because he loved it more than he loved most people. I sewed one of those little tracking tags, the kind my daughter Claire uses for her luggage. 3 careful stitches from a librarian who mends book spines. I wanted to know, in the days after the funeral, exactly where my dead husband walked. Call it a widow's curiosity. It would turn out to be the stitch that saved his life. On Saturday, September 6th, at 7:15 in the morning, my telephone rang and Diane Foster's voice. Cracking, gasping, magnificent. She should have gone to Hollywood. Told me that Gerald had collapsed at the lake cabin, helping her fix a gutter, that the ambulance was too late, that he was gone. Margaret, he's gone. I'm so sorry. He's gone. I gripped the counter and I wept down the phone line, loudly, brokenly, and I am not ashamed to tell you that the tears were real. They were simply not for the reason she believed. I was not crying for a dead husband. I was crying for a marriage that had died months before, at a workbench, in 12 words. She'll cry, she'll cook, and she'll sign whatever we put in front of her. The next 5 days were the strangest of my life, and I lived through the death of both my parents. I received casseroles for a man who was eating sandwiches in a cabin 11 miles away. I accepted condolences from women I had known 50 years, and I could not tell one of them the truth, and every hug cost me something I cannot name. Pastor Reeves sat with me an hour on Tuesday and read the 23rd Psalm, and I let him, because he needed to give comfort as much as I was supposed to need it, and because I have never in my life been so aware of the words, "He restoreth my soul." There was one person I would not lie to, and I fought Detective Cruz over it in my living room on Sunday night with the door locked and the radio on. My daughter, Claire, is 40 years old and lives in Seattle, and when Diane's performance went out over the family phone tree, Claire booked a flight before I could reach her. I told Anita Cruz, flatly, that my child was not going to stand at a hole in the ground and grieve her living father while I watched, that some prices I would pay for this case, and that was not one of them, and if that made me a difficult old woman, then she should write difficult in her report and underline it. Cruz argued operational security for 10 minutes. Then she looked at my face and gave up, the way smart people do, and we called Claire together on a detective's telephone that could not be traced. I will not repeat everything my daughter said when she understood what her father and her Aunt Diane. She had called that woman Aunt Diane since she was 6 years old, had built. Some of it was language I did not teach her. But I will tell you what she said at the end, because I wrote it in the spiral notebook with everything else that mattered. Mom, you figured this out alone, in that house, eating dinner across from him every night. Don't you ever let anyone call you fragile again, including me. She flew in Wednesday. She sat beside me through all of it, the casseroles, the condolences, Diane's coffee. And she performed her grief so well it frightened me a little, and every few hours, when no one was looking, she would find my hand and press it twice. 2 presses. It meant, I know, and you are not alone in the knowing. I had carried the truth by myself for 3 months. You cannot imagine the weight of it until someone takes one handle. Diane practically moved into my house. I want you to understand what that woman did. She slept in my guest room. She answered my telephone. She stood in my kitchen in my mother's apron making coffee for the mourners, and she held my hand across that kitchen table, looked into my eyes, and said, "Margaret, I promise you, you will get through this, because I am not going anywhere." 31 years of friendship, and she performed grief at me over coffee she made with my beans, in my cups, planning to fly to Lisbon on my husband's arm before the headstone was carved. There were moments I studied her face for the seam in the mask, some flicker of shame. I never found one. I have thought about that often since. Some people do not wear masks. Some people simply have two faces, and you have only ever been shown the one. She also. And Detective Cruz had told me to expect this, began the paperwork ballet. Tuesday evening, so gently, so helpfully. "Margaret, Tommy says there are some forms, releases, the plot, and there's apparently an insurance thing Gerald set up, some trust to spare you the taxes. You know how he was. Don't worry about reading it all tonight, sweetheart. Just sign where the little flags are." Little flags. She put a pen in my hand at my own kitchen table. I looked at the pages just long enough, let my eyes swim, and said, "Oh, Diane, I can't see straight today. After the funeral. Everything after the funeral." And she stroked my hair and said, "Of course. After the funeral," and Detective Cruz photographed every page of it the next morning while Diane was at the hairdresser. Forged initials. My name, practiced. In the folder was a quitclaim deed for my house. My mother's house money. They had not even planned to leave me the roof. The viewing was set for Friday evening, the funeral for Saturday at 11. Closed casket, of course. His wish, you remember, Margaret, he told you himself. The plan, as Detective Cruz explained it to me Thursday night in Rosalind's office, was surgical. Let the funeral proceed. Let the certificate finish filing. Arrest Gerald quietly at the cabin Saturday afternoon and take Diane, Tommy, and Halloran the moment the claim went in. Clean. No scene. No spectacle at a church. Then came Saturday morning, 5:04 a.m., and everything I have told you so far became the second strangest part of this story. I was awake. I had not really slept in 6 days. Sitting in Gerald's recliner with a cup of tea, and out of habit, the way you check a sleeping child, I opened the little tracking application on my phone to look at the gray overcoat. For 5 days, that dot had sat at Barton Lake, steady as a lighthouse, while my husband waited out his own mourning. I found it comforting in a way I refuse to apologize for. You may know exactly where your betrayal lives and still need to check on it at night. The dot was not at the lake. The dot was at 214 Delano Avenue, Foster and Sons Funeral Home. It had arrived, the history showed, at 2:41 a.m. I sat very still. I made myself think like Marcus. Reason 1. Gerald, reckless, sneaking in to see his own casket. Vain, stupid, possible. Reason 2. The coat alone, brought in for some purpose. Reason 3. I did not want to think reason 3. But I had spent all summer learning to look at what people do rather than what they say, and what Diane Foster had been doing, for weeks, was arranging a world in which Gerald Hale did not exist. His signature practiced, his assets pooled into a trust with her name as sole trustee, his death certificate real and legal and filed. I had seen the trust documents. Rosalind had walked me through them, and one detail had snagged like a hangnail. The D and G family trust paid out, in every scenario, through Diane. Gerald had built a machine for disappearing and handed his best beloved the only key. He had trusted her completely. Well, I knew better than anyone alive what her complete trust was worth. I called Detective Cruz at 5:11 a.m. I will not pretend I said it calmly. I said, "Anita, the coat is at the funeral home. The coat has been there since 2:41, and I need you to think about what a woman gets if the death certificate is real and the man is actually in the box." There was a silence of maybe 4 seconds, and then she stopped sounding sleepy. She said the GPS on the Buick showed it had made the same trip, cabin to Delano Avenue and back, between 2:20 and 3:50 a.m., with a second vehicle, Tommy Foster's van, arriving in the same window. She said a judge would need more than a luggage tag and a bad feeling to stop a lawful funeral. And then she said the sentence that put me in the front pew 4 hours later with my heart going like a trapped bird. "The fastest legal way to open that casket, Mrs. Hale, is for the widow to ask, 'Can you do that? Can you get us to that casket without spooking them into moving it? I said yes. Of course I said yes. I had been rehearsing the role of Gerald Hale's widow for 3 months. I was ready for opening night. I should tell you about Friday evening, the night before, the viewing at Foster & Sons. Because when I stood in that room, I still believed the casket held 180 pounds of sandbags. And the memory has rearranged itself since the way memories do when you learn what was actually in the room with you. The viewing parlor smelled of carnations and lemon polish. Tommy Foster greeted mourners at the door with both hands, the two-handed clasp they must teach in mortuary school, and he called me Mrs. Hale in a voice like velvet drapes. This man who had buried my mother, who had adjusted the flowers at her service with such tenderness that I wept at his kindness and sent a thank you card. The closed casket sat on its bier with Gerald's framed photograph on top. The photograph Diane had selected, Gerald at 60, tanned, laughing on the boat my $27,000 had bought. Even his memorial portrait was invoiced to me. Barb from the lodge held my hand and told me Gerald was the finest man Ronnie ever knew. The choir sang 2 verses of Abide With Me and cried through the second one. And Diane stood beside the casket half the evening like a co-widow, one hand resting on the oak lid, accepting condolences that were not hers to accept. And at one point, I watched this happen. She patted the lid twice, softly, the way you would pat a sleeping child, and pressed a tissue to her mouth. The room sighed at her devotion. I remember thinking, she is patting sandbags, and even her tenderness is staged. It was not sandbags. By 2:41 the following morning, that same hand would help carry the man himself through the loading door and back, and I have wondered since whether she patted the lid again once he was truly inside it. I have decided not to keep wondering. There are rooms and other people you should not furnish. The funeral of Gerald Hale began at 11 o'clock sharp at Grace Methodist, the same church where I had married him in a hand-sewn dress, and I want to describe it to you exactly, because I stood inside it knowing everything, and I will never see anything like it again. The oak casket sat below the altar under a spray of white lilies Diane had chosen. He loved lilies, didn't he, Margaret? And he did not. He was allergic, but the dead cannot sneeze. So who was I to argue? 140 people came. Ronnie from the lodge served as pallbearer and wept. Tommy Foster stood at the back of his own crime scene in a beautiful charcoal suit, hands folded, wearing the professional sorrow of a man whose family has been folding hands at the backs of rooms since 1948. Somewhere near the fairgrounds, Dr. Holleran was presumably enjoying his $15,000. Detective Cruz sat 6 rows back in a navy dress, one of 4 officers scattered through the congregation looking like cousins. And in the front pew, at the widow's right hand, holding my arm at the elbow like something precious, sat Diane Foster, in black, dabbing her eyes. I keep returning to one moment. Midway through the second hymn, Diane leaned close, pressed her cheek to my shoulder, and whispered, "He's at peace, Margaret. Wherever he is, he's at peace." And I looked at the casket, and I thought, you drugged him with his own heart pills ground into his own whiskey? You and your cousin carried him through the loading door of a funeral home at 2:30 in the morning? And in 90 minutes, you intend to lower him into the ground at Reslawn Cemetery and stand beside me while they do it. And then you intend to collect $750,000 for the privilege. He is not at peace, Diane. He is unconscious. There is a difference, and it is approximately 6 feet. That is when I understood the full shape of it, not just the crime, but the poetry of the crime. Diane's plan was perfect because it was Gerald's plan. Every document he forged to fake his death made her murder legal. Every lie he told made her cover story. The man had spent 6 months building his own coffin and calling it a getaway car. If I had been 1 degree less careful, 1 stitch less thorough, 1 hour later checking a little gray dot on a telephone, it would have worked. She would have stood at that graveside holding my hand, and I would have comforted her. Pastor Reeves finished the eulogy. Kind words for an unkind man. Pastors are merciful, and announced that the family would now have a moment of farewell before the procession to Reslawn. This was the moment Detective Cruz and I had built at 7 o'clock that morning, standing in Rosalind's office with cold coffee. The widow requests a private goodbye, casket side. Nothing suspicious. Nothing anyone could refuse a woman of 67 in a black dress. Tommy Foster's jaw tightened when I rose. I saw it, One small tectonic slip in the professional sorrow. But there is no funeral director on this earth who can tell a widow she may not approach her husband's casket in front of 140 witnesses. That was my weapon, in the end. Their entire scheme required me to be a prop at the center of a public ritual, so I used the ritual. Props cannot be refused their scene. I walked to the casket alone. My heels on the stone floor were the only sound in the church. I had brought a single white rose from my own garden. The bush Gerald gave me for our 30th anniversary, which I mention because I have a sense of occasion. I stood over the polished oak lid, and I laid the rose down very gently, and I leaned in as if for a whisper of grief, and what I said, at a volume calibrated for one set of ears and no other, was, "I know you can hear me." For a moment, nothing. Long enough for doubt to put its cold finger on the back of my neck. And then, softly, unmistakably, in front of God and Grace Methodist, the lid moved. A shift. A knock, dull and interior, like a knuckle against a door in a dream. The lilies trembled. A woman in the third row screamed. And Gerald Hale, sedated, zip-tied, and buried alive in every sense, but the final one, chose that moment to come far enough out of Diane's cocktail to try to sit up inside his own coffin. What happened in the next 90 seconds, I will carry with perfect clarity to my own funeral, which will be open casket. Thank you. Detective Cruz was moving before the scream finished, badge already out, calling, "Nobody leaves the building." 2 officers came up the side aisles. Tommy Foster, third-generation professional, turned smoothly toward the loading door and walked directly into the chest of a sheriff's deputy dressed as a mourning cousin. Pastor Reeves, God bless the man, said, "Oh no," into a live microphone, twice. And Diane. Diane rose from the front pew, and for one heartbeat, before the calculation, before the mask found its next face, she looked at that shuddering casket with an expression I had seen once before, in April, in my kitchen. Appraisal. A problem to be repriced. Then she turned to me, arms opening, voice already climbing into the register of horror. "Margaret! Oh my God! Margaret! What is happening?" I stepped back from her arms. I looked at my best friend of 31 years, and I said, clearly, in the church where I was married, "Sit down, Diane. You have carried enough today. You carried him at 2:41 this morning." They opened the casket right there, at the altar, because Detective Cruz was not about to let it out of her sight. And there was my husband, gray-faced, breathing, eyes swimming up out of the sedative into the lights of the church, wrists bound with the plastic ties from his own workbench, wearing his good gray overcoat, my 3 small stitches still holding in the lining. The first face he focused on was mine. And the first word Gerald Hale said, back from the dead, in front of 140 people, was, "Margie?" "Hello, Gerald," I said. "You're at your funeral. You had some trouble with the guest list." The reckoning did not happen all at once. Real reckonings never do. They arrive in installments, like the debts they are. Diane's installment came first, that same afternoon, in an interview room at the county building, and Detective Cruz let me watch a portion of the recording later because, she said, I had earned it. I want you to know how Diane Foster defended herself, because it tells you everything about who had been sitting at my table for 31 years. She did not deny the affair. She did not deny the fraud. The recordings and the forged flags and Holleran's confession made denial a luxury she couldn't afford. What she fought, tooth and polished nail, was the word murder. He was never in danger, she said, 20 times, 40 times, her voice level as a countertop. Tommy was going to switch the casket at the cemetery. It was a scare, a message. Gerald was getting cold feet, and I needed him committed. Committed. In a sealed box, under a filed death certificate, with the only person scheduled to dig him up being her cousin and co-defendant, whose van, the warrants showed, was booked on the 4:15 p.m. ferry out of Sandusky that same day. 1 passenger, 1 vehicle. The prosecutors did not believe in the casket switch. Neither did the jury, eventually. Neither, I promise you, do I. When she finally understood that the level voice wasn't working, Diane tried one last door. She asked to see me. She sent word through her public defender that she needed me to know it was never about you, Margaret. I declined the invitation, but I did send back a reply, through Rosalind, 11 words long. I know it was never about me. That was the problem. Gerald's installment was different, and I will be honest about it because I promised you honesty, and I have kept every promise I ever made, which is rather the theme of this story. Gerald broke, not in the interview room. At the arraignment, when he stood in a jumpsuit in the same county courthouse where we had once contested a property tax bill together, and he looked into the gallery and found me. And this 69-year-old man began to cry in a way I had never seen him cry, not at his mother's funeral, not ever. Later, through his lawyer, he asked to see me too, and unlike Diane, I went. I went because 41 years buys one conversation, even now. He sat across the glass, thinner already, and he said, "She was going to bury me, Margie. She sat with you in our kitchen and she was going to bury me." He said, "You saved my life." He waited for me to soften. I felt the pull of it. You do not simply amputate 4 decades. And I looked at this man I had fed and funded and forgiven since Ronald Reagan's first term, and I said, "No, Gerald, my mother's stitches saved your life. I just never learned how to stop mending your things." And then I asked him the only question I had actually come to ask. "In the garage, you said I'd cry, cook, and sign. In 41 years, did you ever once see me?" He opened his mouth. Nothing came. That silence was the truest thing my husband ever gave me. And I took it home, and I have kept it. And some nights I take it out and look at it, and it hurts less every time. And then there was the town, because a scheme like this does not have 3 victims. It has a congregation of them. Millbrook took it the way small towns take everything, loudly at the diner and quietly at church. 140 people had to go home and understand that they had wept real tears over a weighted lie, and each of them handled the bill differently. Barb from the lodge did not speak to me for a month, and when she finally did, standing in the canned goods aisle at Kroger's, she said, "I'm not angry you didn't tell me, Margaret. I'm angry it worked on me." And then she hugged me so hard my glasses went crooked, and we were all right after that. Pastor Reeves preached the following Sunday on Psalm 55. "It was not an enemy that reproached me. Then I could have borne it. But it was thou, mine own familiar friend." And did not look at my pew once, which was its own form of looking, and afterward at the door, he held my hand and said only, "You sat in my church for 6 days carrying that. Come see me when you're ready to put it down." I did go, eventually. That is a different story. And the choir. My choir, Diane's choir, 2 altos and 1 hymnal. Voted without any discussion at all to move me into Diane's chair, front row, and nobody ever said why, and nobody ever had to. Small towns cannot always find the words. They can always find you a chair. The legal arithmetic, since I promised you specifics, and I always pay in full. Diane Foster pled to insurance fraud, forgery, and kidnapping. The attempted murder charge traded away in the plea, which stung until Rosalind explained the math, and received 22 years. Thomas Foster lost the funeral home his grandfather built and received 9 years for his cooperation, which came fast and came weeping. Dr. Holleran surrendered his license and got 3 years and a tax bill that outlived his sentence. And Gerald, insurance fraud, conspiracy, forgery, received 5 years, 4 suspended, because the prosecutor agreed that being murdered by your co-conspirator constitutes, in her words, a mitigating experience. He serves his year in Marion. He writes to me. I do not write back, but I have not told the post office to stop the letters. Make of that what you will. I have decided I am allowed to be 67 and complicated. Meridian Life paid out nothing, obviously, though Marcus Webb sent me a fruit basket and a note that said, "First one in 26 years. Retiring while I'm ahead." Rosalind converted my sealed separation into a divorce that gave Gerald, by his own signed stipulation, nothing. Not the house that was never his, not the pension, not the furniture my inventory proved was mine down to the last lamp. The quitclaim deed with my practice signature sits in an evidence box in the county building, and sometimes I think about how close my mother's house came to that little signing flag. Just sign where the flags are, sweetheart. I bought a new kitchen table in November, not because I couldn't afford to keep the old one, because I could afford not to. And here is the ending I have earned, so I will keep it short, the way true things are. On the first warm Saturday of spring, my daughter Claire flew in from Seattle, and we spent the afternoon in my garden, and she asked me, carefully, if I was lonely in the house now. I looked at my 30th anniversary rosebush, which is blooming this year like it has something to prove, and I told her the truth. I said, "Sweetheart, I was lonely for years. I was lonely at a full table. This is not loneliness. This is quiet." My mother told me to watch what people do with my quiet. They filled it with lies and schemes and little signing flags because they mistook it for emptiness. It was never empty. It was a library. And every quiet woman my age knows exactly what a library is. A place where everything is recorded, everything is remembered, and everything, sooner or later, comes due. If this story stayed with you, I would love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me, what would you have done in my place? And from where in the world are you listening? Don't forget to like and subscribe, please. There is so much more waiting for you. With love and respect. Until next time.